Cheers, everybody!
One number on a pad. One missing button. The rest is testimony. Picture a kitchen table at 8:31, paper bright, a yellow legal pad set beside a cooling mug. On the top line, thick Sharpie ink, 140.0. It is not a prediction, it is a pressure gauge. Hours later, 1,000,000 screens will show a different absence. The buy button gone, as if a doorway had been bricked over between breakfast and noon. This archive is a ledger of how those two images rhyme. On one side, ink that doesn't move. On the other, a market that suddenly couldn't. Between them, people, models, and the plumbing that pretends not to matter until it does. You will hear a quiet notification ping each time the number returns, pitched lower on every recurrence. When it reaches the octave below, you'll know we're near the moment the button disappears. That motif is our metronome. The entries that follow are dated, witnessed, and bound to places you can find on a map. Boston kitchens, suburban basements, Menlo Park ops floors, hearing rooms in Washington. Stakes? Never merely financial. What counts as fair when speed meets scarcity? What trust is worth when rules meet reality? Whether a crowd is a voice or a variable. We open the file not to relitigate a frenzy, but to hear, with care and rigor, how a single integer became a system limit and a mirror. The witness is ready. The ledger turns to a friend of Roaring Kitty. File begins.
Prologue. At 08:31, the kitchen light found the gloss on a yellow legal pad and the steam off my mug. Keith had his spreadsheet open cells like chess squares, no hype, just inputs you can audit. Float here, short interest there, borrow ticking like a metronome. He didn't say target. He tapped the corner of the screen where a percentage lived, and I wrote it on the pad in thick block letters 140 Daciaro. The Sharpie bled slightly, the number looked heavier than ink. I snapped a photo because I wanted proof of the moment we stopped arguing about whether reality was overheated and started measuring whether the pipe could carry what was already in it. We weren't chasing a rocket someone had welded the fuel line. He folded the red headband over the webcam the way a notary folds a ribbon, not for costume, for contract. That strip of fabric had rules. If he was going to sit in a cheap chair and talk to strangers, he would show his worksheets, show his fills, show his drawdowns, and say the quiet parts concentration, conviction, and cost out loud. Transparency buys time buys understanding. Understanding, in markets, sometimes buys you price. The paradox hook writes itself, though it never felt like a hook when we lived it. At 12:03, the buy button vanishes from a swath of phones at 08:31. We wrote why. Not in prophecy, no dates, no fireworks, just 3 digits that describe a shape. When more stock is promised to be delivered back than exists in the lanes that can carry it. Any demand is a pry bar, any time delay a torque wrench. Days to cover, he said, and my pen underlined the words twice because the math was mundane and the implications were not. Boston air was brittle that week, frost on porch railings, quiet streets made quieter by masks and remote everything. On his screen, a price that had spent months under 20 now twitched like a sleeper coming back to the room. Weeks of quiet accumulation had the texture of someone counting breaths. The phone on the table buzzed one message, then another ordinary pings that didn't know they would become a motif in our heads. Ping. I set the legal pad to the left of the keyboard so the number would be in frame if the camera caught the corner. No slogans, just a datum you could pause on. Post the clip? He asked. Not a victory lap, there weren't any victories yet, just a short explainer. Why a retailer you could map with darkened storefronts and thinning foot traffic might still be mispriced on optionality. Why a credible activist with a customer-obsessed playbook and a console cycle could matter. Why short interest is not an opinion but an obligation. He didn't practice lines. He practiced honesty. If you're going to be loud, be legible. We rinsed the cups. We walked to our desks. The first green bars on pre-market were small enough to ignore. We didn't. I saved the photo of the pad into a folder called Ledger, because that's what the day required. Seeds now, payoffs later, timestamps on everything. Ping 1/2 step lower. The phones began their soft insurrection the moment we sat down. Buzz, ping, buzz group chats surfacing old threads. A broker notification about elevated borrow. A cousin forwarding a meme with a rocket tape to a CRT. Pre-January, the tape had been a metronome under 20, drifting, occasionally coughing up volume like a body remembering to breathe. The buying then was patient, almost impolite in its discretion, tucking lots away the way you salt cash into an envelope and forget the drawer exists. We had the photo of 140, 0 taken at 08:31 ink thick enough to cast a shadow filed under Ledger, the first seed we were willing to be judged against. From here on, I promised myself to write this like an audit you could replay. Seeds now, payoffs later, time-stamped and testable. At tilde 20 minutes, we'd explain why that number wasn't a target but a ratio. The float sold short, a snake swallowing more body than it owned. At tilde 40, we'd show how a ratio becomes a fuse when days to cover meets the physics of limited lanes. At tilde 60, we'd trace who moved first when that fuse met call gamma and inventory got yanked off the shelf faster than anyone modeled. At tilde 90, we'd return to the Sharpie scrawl, not as a joke, but as a system, limit the kind of limit the street assumes retail can't find until it does. At tilde 120, we'd walk out with the human truth. 140 was a blind spot about people, not numbers. That was my contract with you, same as the headband was Keefe's with his audience. If we plant it, we pay it off. If we say it, we show it. So, here's the ledger's first page. The price context, sub-20s, months of quiet hands, the accumulation, dull, deliberate, occasionally drowned out by larger market noise, the culture, irony disguising organization, and the morning fact pattern, a percentage on a screen, a number on a pad. If you listen closely, you'll hear our motif descend a half step every time 140.9UR returns like a pressure valve tightening. Ping. And whenever we pass a marker 20/40/60/90/100, 20, you'll feel the chair legs scrape the floor a little. Not drama friction. Because this is how we'll keep score, not on whether the candles got long or the tweets got loud, but on whether every clue we plant earns its keep in the minutes ahead.
Chapter 1. The World Before.
Before the noise, the numbers were bleak enough to pass for quiet. Brick and mortar had been losing altitude for years. In 2019, the company killed its dividend to conserve cash. A small obituary pinned to a larger trend of foot traffic thinning out like winter air. By the time the pandemic hit, the store map looked like a constellation going out star by star. Temporary closures, then strategic dedensification, leases renegotiated or surrendered, entire regions shuttered. Fiscal 2020 would end with a smaller footprint by design and by force. The press language was clinical, a 12% reduction in stores, net 693 closures, and a pivot to curbside and ship from store to catch whatever fell through the ceiling. The subtext was simple. The old floorboards were creaking. Losses told the rest of the story. Fiscal 2019 was a blood-red page. Roughly $471 million net loss followed by another loss in fiscal 2020, smaller at about $215 million, but still a loss, still a headline you read twice, because you're measuring whether the patient is stabilizing or just sedated. Bear cases don't need poetry, they need a slope and a clock, and both were visible. Hardware was migrating to digital delivery. Pre-owned margins were compressing, and the mall itself, our old cathedral, had become a liability. You didn't have to be cruel to be short, you just had to be early. And yet, in the same filings that read, like triage notes, a spark lived in the footnotes. Fourth quarter 2020 e-commerce didn't just improve, it detonated up 175% year over year, and suddenly 34% of the entire quarter's sales versus 12% a year earlier. For 9 holiday weeks, ending January 2, 2021, online sales rose 309%, a number that feels like a typo until you remember what a lockdown does to a checkout button. The store count shrank, the digital funnel widened, the company was, briefly, 2 stories at once. If you were long optionality, you circled those lines. If you were short inevitability, you skipped them. COVID didn't invent the bear thesis, it accelerated it. When doors lock and supply chains seize, inventory turns slow, margins wobble, and you pray for new consoles to restart the cycle. That was the setup until late 2020, a wind down of the prior generation, then a handoff to PS5 and Xbox Oxygen arriving late to a crowded room. Management leaned into the only levers still moving: cost cuts, balance sheet repair, and the declaration more aspiration than proof that transformation was underway. Meanwhile, the market read the old trend line as destiny. Shorts scaled in, because that's what the slope taught them to do. But price doesn't argue, it listens. In the months that followed, those e-commerce lines and that console cycle would become the contrarian spark candidates Keith kept showing on his stream, not fairy dust, just asymmetry. A brand with residual trust, a customer file that still answered emails, and a channel mix that could move faster than leases could expire. None of that invalidated the decay, it complicated it. And complicated is enough when the float is tight and obligations are larger than the shelf. So the world before wasn't a fairy tale with a villain, it was a balance sheet with a timer. Stores closing, losses narrowing, but still red, a digital lung suddenly pulling hard, and a new hardware cycle inbound. That is the ground the bears stood on when they crowded in falling traffic, pressured margins, secular drift. That is also the ground a few value weirdos stood on when they sniffed mispricing optionality, misread as noise, a pivot discounted to zero. Same facts, different weights. r/WallStreetBets smelled like a locker room and a lecture hall sharing the same vent. The front page was a collage, rainbow charts, margin calls confessed like sins, screenshots of accounts bleeding red and then laughing at the stain. Loss porn wasn't self-harm, it was a handshake. I will show you pain so you know I've paid my dues. Under that irony sat cohesion. We liked the stock wasn't analysis, it was a password that turned strangers into a unit. Diamond hands began as a joke and became a rule of engagement. Hold not because it feels good. Hold because exit pressure is someone else's premise. If you say it together enough times, you can borrow each other's resolve for a few ticks when the tape argues back. What the forum actually optimized for was narrative compression. Long theses die, online repeatable lines live. Short interest, float, borrow. Days to cover all the mouthfuls Keith kept on his spreadsheet were translated into a handful of repeatable memetics that could ride 1,000 comments without breaking. The culture made room for statistics with punchlines. A ratio becomes a punch becomes a banner. On the surface, rocket ships and YOLO. Underneath, the slow construction of a group risk tolerance calibrated in public. Coordination didn't look like a meeting. It looked like a morning post. A what are your positions? Roll call. A tide of upvotes that functioned like a quorum. The forum had a cadence, pre-market bravado, midday gallows humor, close-of-day autopsies. The best comments weren't the loudest. They were the legible ones, screenshots you could audit, entries and exits you could timestamp. That's why the headband mattered. A thesis with a face is a fuse with a timer. Every upload stamped the clock. An early YouTube thumbnail with the red band a little crooked, title type slightly off, the kind of image you scroll past until the frame catches on something true in the eyes. cross-posted to the day's megathread with a blunt caption and no promises. Here's the math, here's the risk, here's why options aren't fireworks, but fulcrums. I watched the comments tilt from ridicule to curiosity in the space of 100 replies. That flip is the internet's rarest commodity, permission to concentrate. The joke ethos hit a ledger. Lost posts carved out a sanctuary where being wrong wasn't exile, it was proof you were playing. Gains, when they arrived, were posted with the same deadpan, as if to say the market didn't grant you character, your process did. That is how holding becomes coordinated without a coordinator. When the crowd agrees on the story and the screenshots rhyme, you don't need a captain, you need a shared clock and a few lines everyone can carry. By the time the price began to lift, that culture had already priced in ridicule and volatility. We weren't waiting for respect, we were waiting for a miscalibration to meet a memory. Think of it this way. The forum built a human buffer against the urge to flinch. Memes were a stopgap against panic, the way a mantra helps a runner hold pace. Ping. In that context, the cross-posted thumbnail wasn't propaganda, it was instrumentation. It gave the swarm a face to time by, and a spreadsheet to police itself with. Payoff at tilde, 45, 00. The fuse reaches the charge, and the face on the thumbnail becomes the metronome everyone hears when the candles go vertical. Catalysts arrive like weather fronts, you don't vote them in, you feel the pressure change. Ryan Cohen's entry felt like that. Not a press release, a barometric drop. Here was the chewy guy, the customer, or bust operator, who turned dog food into a logistics religion, accumulating a stake, writing a letter that didn't waste verbs, and pointing, with almost rude clarity, at the gap between a loyal customer base and a business model stuck between aisles. The bears read it as performative. We read it as intent. Activists trade in a currency called credibility. The good ones have a way of making even obvious sentences feel like marching orders. If he could drag a pet supplies startup through the thicket of last-mile economics, what might he do with a retailer whose customers already wore the brand on their sleeves? Then came the console cycle, PS5 and Xbox humming at the threshold, demand outstripping oxygen. Product cycles are gravity, they pull foot traffic, accessories, warranties, trade-ins, and if you can stand up the pipes online carts. You don't need miracles, you need throughput, faster pages, better search, tighter pick/pack/ship, curbside that doesn't feel like a penalty box. A new box under the TV creates 1,000 small purchases around it, like moons. Bears could be right about the long fate of discs and still be wrong about the next 12 to 24 months of cash flow. Cycles do that they make inevitable feel negotiable. Brand was the third rail no one priced properly. Not brand as billboard, brand as habit. The account you've had since middle school, the clerk who remembers your trade-in preference, the ritual of a midnight release that moved online, but still lived in people. That file of emails and purchase histories is not nostalgia, it's retargetable intent. Pair a credible operator's playbook with a hungry cycle and a database of customers who like the stock in both senses, and optionality stops being a fairy tale. It becomes a discounted cash flow that refuses to behave. This is why Keith kept hammering the same slide. Credible activist plus product cycle plus working e-com equals repricing. Not to the moon, to the realm where shorts have to ask harder questions about borrow and days to cover when the shelf gets light. Show me the pipe, he'd say, and then show the curbside metrics, the ship-from-store pilot, the service levels creeping in the right direction. He didn't promise reinvention in a quarter. He promised enough execution to break a thesis that depended on stasis. If you're short destiny, catalysts are noise. If you're long asymmetry, catalysts are clocks. Cohen's letters, the console scarcity, the early e-com wins, those were our ticks. Each made 140, 0 feel less like graffiti and more like a pry bar already wedged beneath the structure. The more credible the operator, the heavier the lever. The closer the cycle, the shorter the fulcrum. And when the lever moves, it doesn't ask permission.
Chapter 2. How it worked.
Here's the primer I wish someone had given us on day one. The float is the shelf, the shares that can actually trade. Short interest is the stack of IOUs against that shelf, the number of shares sold but still owed back. Borrow is the rent you pay to keep that IOU open. Days to cover, DTC, is the time it would take, at recent average volume, for every IOU to be repurchased without breaking anything. Short interest divided by average daily volume. None of these are exotic. What made them dangerous was scale and sequence. When short interest climbs past the float, when the IOUs outnumber what's on the shelf, you're not predicting fireworks, you're describing a queue that can't clear at ordinary speed. That's all 140. Zero was. A ratio that said, even if nobody else showed up to buy, the shorts alone could crowd the doorway. How do you get past 100%? Through the dullest magic in markets. Lending chains. A share is lent, sold short to a buyer. Then that buyer's custodian can lend the same share again. The plumbing is legal, audited, and boring until it isn't. The result is synthetic abundance on the way down, lots of sellable supply, and synthetic scarcity on the way up. Lots of people who must someday buy back. Borrow fees are the price of that privilege. When they rise, they eat into the patience of shorts and the capital of their lenders. Rising borrow is not just a cost, it is a clock. Now, put that clock next to DTC. If DTC swells while price rises, you get a choke. The more painful it becomes to wait, the longer the line to exit. At 140, zero, every marginal uptick in price pressures, two balance sheets at once, the short, who must eventually cover, and the broker who must margin the position. Choke points appear everywhere. Hard to borrow flags that make new shorts rarer. Borrow recalls when a lender wants their share back today, not someday. Locate failures that turn a trade from can do to can't. Volatility halts that splice demand into bursts, and above it all, risk systems that translate volatility into bigger collateral asks. None of that requires conspiracy. It requires arithmetic plus a busy tape, and then there is the unintended accomplice, options. Calls bought by retail mean dealers, long gamma, hedging by buying shares into strength. That hedging doesn't care about anyone's thesis, it cares about delta and time. When it meets a 140% short base, it turns someday demand, the short's eventual buybacks, into today scarcity, fewer shares loose on the shelf. That's why, at -60 minutes in our ledger, we'll track who moved first, as call-driven hedging met obligations already larger than the float. So here is how to read our timestamps. At -20 minutes, we'll prove the plain meaning of 140, zero, not a target, a ratio, IOU's shelf. At -40, we'll walk the DTC fuse and why traffic engineering, not memes, made covering mechanically explosive. At -60, we'll diagram the moment gamma pull met short push and the spring snapped where the metal was thinnest. Everything after that is consequence. Borrow climbing, recalls landing, halt slicing, and the first balance sheets blinking. If this sounds clinical, good. The miracle of January wasn't magic, it was math meeting memory in public. Credentials first, because the internet loves to confuse volume for validity. Keith had the boring stack you never meme. Licenses passed, compliance training signed, a track record you could actually audit in a real firm's system. He kept receipts like a clerk, broker statements, execution logs, cost basis down to the penny. When he said I liked the stock, it wasn't poetry, it was an underwriting memo with a webcam. He didn't posture as a guru. He positioned himself as a patient clerk of a single thesis, willing to publish his ledger until either the math or he broke. His pedagogy was insultingly simple. He'd open the stream with the same grid you've seen 100 times screenshotted. Ticker, shares, calls, strikes, expiries, cost, value, P/L. No confetti, no soundboard. The ritual did the work. Line by line, he'd reconcile last week's entries to this week's reality, narrating slippage and mistakes without hedging the language. I sized too early. This roll cost me theta I didn't earn back. I'm concentrated, here's why. The grid sat there like a courtroom exhibit. Shares for permanence, calls for torque, cash for sleep. Concentration wasn't a dare, it was a disclosure. If he added, you saw the lots. If he trimmed, you saw the timestamp. If he did nothing, you learned that too in action, as a decision, published. The calls were not fireworks, they were levers. He explained them like an actuary doing stand-up. Why time mattered more than hero strikes, why near-the-money delta is a dial, not a slot machine, why liquidity in the chain is oxygen, why you never let premium become your boss. Shares anchored conviction, calls expressed timing. When he stepped up risk, he said the quiet parts. This is uncomfortable. When he stepped down, he said the part no one clips. Opportunity cost is still a cost. The result was a kind of financial literacy that didn't flatter the listener, it deputized them. You didn't leave entertained, you left obligated to know your own numbers. Repetition made the contract real. Night after night, the grid returned with new dates and the same columns. Transparency turned strangers into auditors, auditors become stakeholders. Spectators began pre-reconciling the sheet in the comments before he got there. You rolled the 12/18s to March, right? Which meant the room wasn't waiting for a call, it was running the play. The YOLO label, a joke at first, mutated into a governance word. If you were going to call it a YOLO, you had to show it. Every leg, every roll, every bruise. Screenshots cut through the fog of adjectives. A position size you can read is a thesis you can inherit. That's how a face on a thumbnail becomes an instrument. The forum didn't just believe him, it synchronized to him. Posting the grid on a cadence created a clock. Cadence created expectation. Expectation created preparation. People arranged capital to be where his spreadsheet pointed, not because he was a messiah, but because he would be back tomorrow to account for his choices in public. Radical transparency does something most research notes can't. It shifts risk from abstract to shared. When you've watched a stranger eat drawdowns in daylight, you borrow a teaspoon of their resolve when your own screen flickers red. The consequences of that teaching style were mechanical, not mystical. A cohort learned why a share is inventory, and a call is a claim on inventory with a timer. They learned that liquidity lives both in the book and in the option chain. They learned that if enough people buy the same kind of claim at the same kinds of strikes, someone on the other side must neutralize that risk in the most boring way possible by buying stock. He never sold that as magic. He diagrammed it as plumbing. And he did it with the only currency that holds online proof. Remember the thumbnail from earlier, the slightly crooked headband, the off-kilter type? In hindsight, it wasn't branding, it was a notarization stamp. Each upload certified a new page in a public ledger of conviction. Shares plus calls, explained, renewed, and paid for with time. From here, the story has to leave the classroom and walk onto the exchange floor. If 1,000 students buy the homework they were assigned, shares for signal, calls for torque, the street doesn't argue, it hedges. And when hedging meets 140 dial, becomes a ratchet, that's the next page in the ledger. We bring the pad back into frame and let the ink do the talking. 140. Zero isn't a prophecy, it's plumbing. Short interest larger than the usable shelf. A ratio, not a rallying cry. The camera lingers, the ping drops a half step, and then we walk it like an audit. If IOUs exceed inventory, any persistent buy pressure stops being a mood and starts being mechanics. Which is why the next link matters. Options aren't fireworks, options are gears. Retail buys calls. Dealers sell those calls and, to remain neutral, they hedge by buying shares. That hedge is insensitive to taunts and memes, it listens only to delta and time. As price lifts, delta rises, hedge size rises, and the dealer's bid climbs the book in real time. That climb quietly removes shares from the loose pile the shorts will someday need to repurchase. Someday gets closer. Borrow fees tick. Recalls nibble. The line at the only exit gets longer while the hallway narrows. Now, put the gear train on the ratio. With 140% short interest, you have synthetic abundance on the way down, lots of apparent supply to short, and synthetic scarcity on the way up. many more obligations to buy back than float available. The call-driven hedge hands the baton to the cash market. Every new strip of calls written forces a matching strip of stock to be bought by the dealer, and every strip the dealer tucks away is one fewer share rattling around when a short decides to tap out. It's not personal, it's scheduled. Time and options becomes time pressure on shorts. Days to cover swells. A 10 a.m. Delta adjustment is a 1 p.m. margin conversation somewhere else. The street can disagree with a thesis. It cannot opt out of arithmetic. We show one clean sketch on a notepad. A little loop that runs itself calls in right arrow dealer, hedge up, right arrow price up, right arrow float, effectively tighter, right arrow float, effectively tighter, right arrow next calls in. If this looks circular, that's because it is. Feedback isn't conspiracy. It's what happens when risk systems that are supposed to be orthogonal end up aligned for a few crucial days. Think of dealers as the metronome and shorts as the choir trying to sight read with a page missing. The metronome doesn't care if the song is good. It keeps time anyway. This is the first payoff. We told you at the kitchen table that 140. 0 was a pressure gauge. Now you can hear it. The number explains why ordinary buying suddenly felt like a pry bar, why thin bands of call flow moved tape like a tide, and why each uptick cost someone who was already paying rent on borrowed shares. The audience doesn't need a sermon, they need a sequence they can replay. Calls right arrow hedge, right arrow inventory, tightens right arrow DTC, stretches right arrow patience, shortens right arrow covers, start as drips and threaten to become a sheet of rain. We close the page without triumphalism. The loop can break, prices fall, deltas roll off, hedges unwind. But on this morning, alignment is real. The grid on the stream, the forum's cadence, the dealer's obligation, and that Sharpie ratio all point the same direction for once. 140. 0 wasn't a target. It was a trap the system set for itself in retail, by accident or design, found the spring. Next, the calendar catches up to the mechanism. Tomorrow stops being theoretical.
Chapter 3. Rising Action.
January 11 began like a routine filing and landed like a weather front. The press wire hit board seats for Ryan Cohen, and 2 lieutenants and the tape snapped awake as if someone had opened a window in a stale room. The forum didn't call it salvation, it called it momentum with a name. Customer or bust, someone wrote, pasting a pull quote, but the more interesting post was quieter. A side-by-side of holiday e-com growth and the chewy playbook annotated with arrows. We watched the pre-market ladder jump in ragged steps, then smooth into a continuous pour as market opened and the room aligned. No speeches on our side, just a closer shot of the grid as Keith went live, columns crisp enough to read without pausing. Shares, calls, expiries, cost basis, P/L. He didn't change fonts, he changed size. A position you can read is a decision you can inherit. I clipped the screen, artifact, #3, and dropped it into the ledger folder with a file name that included the minutes stamp and a single tag, size equals sentence. 9 days later, provocation. January 19, mid-morning. A well-known short seller teased a live take that framed buyers as the punchline. It wasn't the thesis we'd heard the thesis for a year, it was the posture, as if the only thing left to measure was how loudly to laugh. The stream hiccuped, the chat did not. The thread filled with counter receipts, store count reductions annotated against lease maturities, channel mix pivots, borrow fees creeping. We like the stock morphed from a wink into a cudgel, 4 words that did not concede the frame. The number on our pad didn't need defending, the mechanics could defend themselves. Rumors began to move like weather too. Desk chats picked up a scent, nothing you could cite. Everything you could feel of a marquee short bleeding faster than the risk committee liked. Borrow tightened for the rest of us. Locate responses took longer and landed with more hedging. You could hear exasperation in the delays. If you stared at the options chain long enough, you saw it there too. Spreads breathing heavier, open interest migrating towards strikes that made hedging less academic and more immediate. The forum, usually a carnival, started posting fewer jokes and more timestamps. Screenshots of fills looked like affidavits. The grid returned on schedule that night. He didn't pound the table, he reconciled the ledger. Shares unchanged, calls rolled, cash reserve trimmed to fund torque. He flagged the risk. This is uncomfortable, and refused to outsource the discomfort to adjectives. That's what made the capture of artifact #3 matter. It wasn't a brag, it was a calibration tool for a crowd that needed to synchronize not on slogans, but on ratios. By morning, the image had propagated, cropped, memed, and, crucially, read. The comments pre-checked his math before he opened his mouth. In a market built on speed, the most subversive act was to be legible. From the street, smoke thickened. Trading chats that never talk about clients started talking about flows. A friend on the ops side texted a nothing burger that felt like a something. Heads up. VAR models are touchy this week. We underlined VAR because touchy models don't care about your tone, they care about variance and volume at the same time. Meanwhile, the call tape clicked like a metronome near the money, decent liquidity, clustered expiries that pulled hedges into today, not next month. Dealers aren't protagonists in stories like these, but their hedges write whole chapters. I printed the grid and taped it next to the legal pad so the two pictures would rhyme when the camera caught the corner. Ink for the ratio, pixels for the position. The forum wasn't coordinating in the cloak and dagger sense, it was converging on the only behaviors that mattered: hold what signals, time what torques, and document both. That's how culture becomes pressure, not by chanting, by reconciling. We closed our laptops later than usual, eyes gritty, the room thin with the kind of silence that follows consensus. Tomorrow would not debate sentiment, it would weigh inventory. If the open brought confirmation flows, hedges, tight borrow rolling into tight supply 140. Zero would stop reading like a note in the margins and start sounding like a siren. Tomorrow's open decides whether the number is graffiti or a gauge. The alert hit like a doorframe to the forehead. Billions in fresh capital for a marquee short, the kind of headline, written to calm rooms with glass walls. Our chats didn't calm. The first take was fatalistic, they'll never be forced. The second was sharper. Lifelines aren't forgiveness, they're time. Time is what a crowded short needs most when 140. Zero sits on the pad like a court order. Ping half step lower. If you listen closely to the forum that afternoon, you could hear the story harden. Not US vs them in the cartoon sense, Goliath vs Swarm in the mechanical one. Concentrated risk with friends in high places. Distributed conviction with receipts. The grid on Keith's stream became a sort of flag position size you could read, cadence you could set your watch by. Screenshots multiplied. If capital was going to step in for the other side, attention would step in for ours. Inside baseball from a friend on the ops floor. Borrow screens felt taut, locate answers slower, haircuts revisited mid-thread, like someone quietly remeasuring a plank. The lifeline didn't remove pain, it anesthetized it just enough to keep a hand on the stove. In the threads, you saw the psychology flip. Where disbelief had lived, surely they'll cap, this resolve moved in. We like the stock now read as we can outlast volatility if the math is still the math. You could feel the room agree to suffer on purpose. That's rare. It's also dangerous when the counterparty is funded to make you prove it. The media frame followed the money. Names in bold, statements in layered sentences. The forum answered with short nouns. Hold, roll, add. Legibility beat volume again. We reposted the earlier artifacts side by side, the Sharpie pad and the YOLO grid so a newcomer could onboard in one glance, ratio on the left, receipts on the right. If the infusion meant the short could choose its exit, it also meant every uptick taxed that choice. Borrow was still a clock. Days to cover, still a hallway. Dealers still hedged when claims arrived. The loop we drew yesterday didn't ask for permission to keep running. By evening, I could hear the metronome in ordinary sounds, the hum of the fridge, the hiss of the radiator, little reminders that markets price patience in seconds, not sermons. Keith closed the stream without chest thumping, reconciled, disclosed, cautioned. Uncomfortable, again. The comment pinned beneath the video wasn't bravado, it was bookkeeping. Strikes, expiries, cash. If a lifeline had shifted the narrative, the ledger would shift it back to arithmetic. That's how crowds stay coherent, someone writes it down. I taped the news clipping next to the legal pad so the file would show both species of confidence. Institutional and retail. Ink and ink. Money and time. Tomorrow would tell us which matters first. If the open brings hedges into the aisle, and the aisle is already tight, the extra runway merely lengthens the sprint. We'll know at the bell. Tomorrow's open will decide if 140. 0 is a note or a siren.
Chapter 4. Peak.
By the morning of January 26, the room sounded different keys a little faster, chairs closer to screens, chats switching from jokes to timestamps. The ratio on the pad hadn't moved, but everything downstream of it had. Bids started showing teeth, the options chain lit at the strikes that pull hedges into today, not next quarter. Then the accelerant, a single word dressed as a joke game stonk, ricocheting across feeds and turning curiosity into kinetic energy. You could feel phones heat up on contact. It didn't change the math, it changed the tempo of people who had to obey it. Volume went from strong to historic in a blink. The near-the-money calls thick enough to be liquid, close enough to move delta began to form a staircase. Dealers, long gamma by obligation, chased neutrality up the rungs, buying stock into strength, adjusting again as price outran their last hedge, then again as the next strike went in the money. Each adjustment removed inventory from the loose pile the shorts would someday need. Someday kept getting rescheduled for this afternoon. Spreads widened the way pupils do in low light. On the tape, the cash bid-ask stopped behaving like a tight hallway and started breathing. Half cents became whole cents, then dimes, then quarters. In the chain, the distance between paying and getting paid turned from a rounding error into a decision. Liquidity wasn't gone, it was conditional, like a bouncer who suddenly knew your name and your limit. In ops chats, friends typed the kind of weather report only they send: locate slower, HTB list longer, VAR touchy. We underline touchy because the street's risk systems don't read memes, they read variance and velocity at the same time. This is where the grid paid off in a way only a ledger can. Screenshots of shares plus calls weren't hype, they were instructions the crowd could execute. Keep the anchor heavy, apply torque where open interest is thick and market depth is shallow enough that delta will ratchet. 1,000 small accounts don't coordinate by whisper, they synchronize by instrument. The grid was the instrument. Dealers don't care who bought the claims, they care that the claims exist and expire on schedules that force them into the book. That's how a thumbnail becomes a metronome. January 27 was the day the staircase got a name. Pre-market already felt like a sprint by the open. The sprint had a marching band. Halts spliced the move into scenes. Every time the play resumed, hedges reloaded a step higher, shorts recalculated patience, and borrow crept like a fever. In the comment threads the tone flattened. Fewer emojis, more receipts, time-stamped fills, brokerage warnings about elevated risk, borrow fees that looked like parking tickets in a snow emergency. We pinned the grid next to the legal pad so the frame held both truths, a ratio you could not charm, and a position you could read. By afternoon, the synchronization was eerie. Screens in Boston, New York, and living rooms you could not plot on a map all seemed to update on the same breath. You could watch the market learn its own condition in real time. Options flow thickens, right arrow dealers chase, right arrow price steps, right arrow halts, reset the board, right arrow shorts test exits, and find the hallway narrower than yesterday. Not destiny plumbing. Not conspiracy compliance with a model. The closing print $347.51 didn't feel like a victory and felt like a reading on a gauge. The number on the pad hummed under it. Ping half step lower. We logged the day as a sequence instead of a headline. Calls concentrated around ladders of strikes, hedges consuming float, at increasing deltas cash spreads, reflecting stress borrow messages moving from fine print to foreground days to cover, stretching in a way you could feel in your throat. Melodrama is easy when candles get long. The ledger is harder. It asks whether each input earned the output we just witnessed. On the 27th, it did. The gear train we had sketched in pencil was now cutting grooves into balance sheets. The mood in our tiny war room stayed clinical by choice. Keith reconciled the sheet, on-stream no confetti, just columns then, said the most adult sentence of the week. Uncomfortable. That word anchored more than any rocket. He reminded the room that leverage has a timer and gamma hours when motion stops. We taped the closing chart beside the $347.51 print and drew a thin line to the ratio on the pad, because cause and effect were about to reverse. Structure had carried price up the staircase overnight. Structure could become the thing that snapped if funding and collateral blinked. Here's the last beat before the cut. After hours, the chain still hummed. Chat rooms replaced jokes with hydration reminders, and ops friends started replying with words and started replying with ellipses. We shut the lids on our laptops. The room suddenly loud with ordinary sounds again. The next file tab in the ledger already had a date stamped January 28. We went to sleep with a staircase. We woke up to a cliff. Dawn, Jan 28. We woke to a pitch that didn't sound like morning. Pre-market screens were already singing five handles. Chat rooms that normally idled on GIF flipped into timestamps and fills. Yesterday had ended like a reading on a gauge $347.51 as a number. Not a victory in the staircase that got its name on the 27th now looked like an escalator someone forgot to switch off. Halts had taught everyone a rhythm. Breathe, reload, ratchet. Today, the rhythm arrived early. The call chain wasn't noise, it was a clutch. Near the money strikes with thick open interest turned hedging into a conveyor. Buy the claim, dealer buys the shares to stay neutral. Price steps. The next strike wakes up. Repeat. The point wasn't who clicked it, was that the plumbing had to answer the click with inventory. Artifact #3, the grid read like a service manual. Anchor with shares. Apply torque at clustered expiries. Let delta do the hauling. That screenshot wasn't bravado. It was a diagram of force transmission the crowd could run without a foreman. By 0900, quotes printed like a metronome that skipped beats. The spread widened, then snapped tight, then widened again, as if liquidity itself were checking its pulse. Brokers pushed new banners, elevated risk. HTB and borrow fees ticked up like cab meters in a storm. You could feel the short book remeasure patience in quarter hours instead of days. Dealers, long gamma by obligation, kept buying into strength to square their books, each hedge lifting price just enough to make the last hedge insufficient. The bandpass of the market narrowed. Any shove became a note you could hear across rooms. Open. The auction cleared high. The first halt arrived like a period where a comma should be. When trading resumed, prints landed in the 480s. $483 would become the lore before. The tape sliced back on a gust of selling and the next halt stitched in. Between those slices, you could hear the market learn itself in real time. Calls right arrow hedges, right arrow price, right arrow exit attempts, right arrow thinner hallways, right arrow calls again. What looked like frenzy from a distance felt, up close, like compliance, with a model written long before anyone cared about a cat and a headband. The forum's language tightened. Fewer rockets, more receipts. Screenshots of orders, slippage notes, broker warnings, side by side with the grid and the yellow pad. So the frame held both truths, a ratio you cannot charm and a position you can read. Options aren't fuel, someone typed. They're gears. The correction came fast. They're both the fuel spins the gears. Either way, the mechanism was visible now. This wasn't sentiment levitating price, this was flow, removing inventory from the loose pile the shorts would someday need, until someday kept arriving before lunch. Somewhere beneath the music, a different instrument began to hum. Ops chat, pings, lost their jokes. A friend who never dramatizes posted a sentence with no emoji and a timestamp. Risk is skittish. No names, No numbers, just the feeling of a room with glass walls watching other rooms with glass walls. We didn't have the email yet, or the acronyms we'd memorized by dinner. We only had the sound of keyboards slowing down when the quote sped up. We pinned the grid on one monitor and the legal pad on the other, listening for the motif. Options weren't noise, they were gears, and they had meshed. The price was writing a paragraph that didn't need adjectives. Then the sound changed, not louder, just emptier, the way a hallway sounds when a door at the end is about to close. We didn't call it a cliff yet, but the air did.
Chapter 5. How it fails.
The ops floor did not look like a battlefield. It sounded like the staccato of mechanical keyboards, the hiss of headsets lifted and replaced, the clipped diction of people who know the nouns that matter. On a second monitor, I kept our two talismans in frame, the Sharpie 140, 0 in the grid, but the third monitor was where the day turned, a clearing message with a subject line that could take oxygen out of a room. NSCC, intraday VAR deposit adjustment, T+2 exposure. Inside were numbers you read once, then again, then out loud to make them real. Volatility had detonated the value-at-risk model concentration, and directional imbalance had turned busy into dangerous unsettled buys stacked into tomorrow and the next day like drifted snow. The system wanted more collateral now. That was not a debate. That was an invoice. Ping half step lower. Here's the plumbing without the perfume. Trades today are T+0 in mood and T+2 in money. Every share hoovered up by hedges, every market order sparked by a chain of calls, every retail fill that printed, while chat rooms chanted none of that, had settled yet. It lived as exposure on the broker's balance sheet, a pipeline of cash out the door in 2 days, marked to a price that wouldn't sit still. NSCC looks at that pipeline and asks a simple, unsentimental question. How much could this flow hurt before we deliver and receive? Then it prices that question with VAR, adds haircuts for concentration, and asks the broker to post a deposit large enough to survive the answer. When volatility goes nonlinear, the ask does too. At 09, 41 and ops lead read totals like a metronome. Recalc coming in 5. Update your ladders. Screens refreshed, and the requirements stepped up again, not because anyone misbehaved in a movie villain sense, but because the tape kept printing higher prints and larger ranges, while the book leaned net long and net unsettled. Directionality mattered. Relentless buy pressure created an exposure profile with far more ways to be wrong right now than to be right later. We watched the risk engine convert those ways into dollars per minute. I took a screenshot, cropped out the letterhead, and saved 3 lines in our ledger. NSCC VAR deposit, T+2, $, billions. Artifact, #4. Not because the email was secret, it wasn't, but because moments like this evaporate beneath the headlines they cause. The phone on the desk buzzed with the same sound it always makes. When a meme lands this time, the tone belonged to math. Up the row, someone said, we're long time, short capital, and the line lodged like a nail. Another recalculation, another ask. Operations built what looked like a war table, but was really a cash flow calendar. Today's trades, tomorrow's novations, the day after's net settles capital buffer marked beside a rising VAR bar that didn't care about tone, hashtags, or the dignity of anyone's press quote. The models weren't angry, they were blind to anything but inputs. Inputs said, range wider, volumes heavier, inventory more one way, counterparties jumpier. Output said, post more. If you need a picture, draw a small timeline, strip T+0, T+2, then stack rectangles for each hour's net buy imbalance and shade them darker as realized volatility climbs. Now sketch a rising step for the deposit ask that sits on top of that stack. Capital is the floor under the steps. On ordinary days, floor and steps never meet. On days like this, the steps learn to sprint. Exposure scales with every incremental unit of flow capital, only scales as fast as wire rooms and credit committees allow. That's the mismatch. A second-by-second requirement chasing a day-by-day buffer. There was no mustache-twirling decision in that hour. There was a spreadsheet that made a choice for everyone in the room, unless someone changed its inputs. You could feel the logic hardening. If you can't reduce volatility or settle faster today, you can only change the shape of your exposure. That thought arrived before the policy did. I watched a manager's knuckles go white on a headset mic as another deposit figure landed. He didn't say panic. He said, options, and got the only honest answer back, plumbing. The question everyone wants a face for arrived as a flowchart. A risk lead dragged the cursor across 3 boxes the way a surgeon taps ribs before an incision. Box 1, raise more capital now. Wires, don't move that fast. Box 2, convince the model the world is calmer than the tape says. Models, don't take phone calls. Box 3, change the shape of the firm's exposure so the NSCC invoice stops sprinting. That one we could touch. If T+2 is a conveyor of unsettled buys, then the only lever that moves in seconds is to stop adding new buys to the belt and let cells run so inventory can walk back off the books. You don't need a villain for that sentence, you need a spreadsheet. Ping half step lower. Language was careful, because language always is, right up until it isn't. Temporary symbol-specific risk controls. Opening transactions restricted. Closing transactions permitted. The euphemisms meant, gray out the buy button on names where the VAR step had outlearned our capital buffers, keep the sell lanes open to bleed down direction and shrink tomorrow's net receivable. In ops, someone translated the policy into plumbing. No new longs, yes to exits. A trader 2 pods over muttered, we just made selling cheaper than buying, and the room didn't argue. The fairness debate tried to squeeze into that hour and found no chair. We weren't grading civics, we were triaging exposure. The deposit ask had become an accelerant. Each fresh uptick, each wider range, each clustered retail fill pushed the requirement up another notch. Restricting buys lowered the convexity of what could go wrong before settlement because it shut off the tap that fed it. Leaving cells open wasn't cruelty, it was the only admissible relief valve. If you close both, you freeze risk in place. If you close neither, you starve the balance sheet. The policy was ugly because the geometry was ugly. We scrolled back to artifact hash for the cropped lines with NSCC VAR deposit, T+2, $billions, and read them like a Miranda warning. Nobody in that email mentioned retail. Retail was an input volume, volatility, directionality, not an identity. When people later asked who crossed the line, I thought of the cursor traveling those 3 boxes. The line wasn't crossed, it was drawn by a model that weights variance and concentration and then priced in dollars per minute. We only colored inside it. Still, mechanics have human edges. The chat rooms that had synchronized to a grid and a ratio now met a rule that didn't fit their moral math. If buying is speech, who pressed mute? Someone wrote, and I didn't have the breath to answer. On the floor, managers read from talking points about market integrity and duty of care. The words were true and insufficient. Duty had more than one counterparty that day. The switch itself was banal, a feature flag, flipped in a console that looked like any other dashboard, a change ticket with 2 approvals, a timestamp that now lives in congressional PDFs. The moment after was not banal. Order entry pop-ups turned into error banners, quotes still danced, fills still printed for, one side. A junior asked the right question out loud. Do we have a timer on this? We had 2, one called capital, one called public. Both were running. I wrote a single sentence in the ledger so I wouldn't let memory tidy it later. We didn't stop people from selling. Because we're cruel, we stopped people from buying, because the invoice outran the wire room. Then I drew an arrow from that line back to the pad on the desk 140, 0 and another to the block diagram of calls and hedges. The system had met the swarm and chosen self-preservation in the only language it speaks. Margin, payoff hash 3 lands here. Not a cabal in a dark boardroom, a risk model slamming into retail velocity and forcing human hands to do what the math had already decided. At 12:03, The policy met the public. The buy button was gone. The sound in the room changed for us, for them, for everyone holding a phone that suddenly learned which side of the book was still legal.
Chapter 6. Edge of the Turn.
At 12:03, the room forgot how to breathe. The buy button didn't vanish with fanfare, it grayed like a bruise, and in that half-second of silence, you could hear the hum of monitors you'd stopped noticing. Then, the noise returned: phones, alerts, the staccato of keys, but it was a different register, thinner, like air at altitude. Order tickets that had been muscle memory now flashed closing only. Chats that had been rockets and rhymes pivoted to screenshots as evidence. Error banners, grayed out toggles, boilerplate pasted and circled in red. Thread titles mutated in real-time rockets to exhibits, diamond to FAQ, class action. The same hands that posted memes were drafting affidavits between breaths. My phone vibrated across the desk with 2 lives at once. First, my mentee's name, a kid who'd been sending me fills for months like book reports. I just got the call: maintenance breach, what do I do? He typed, then called before I could answer. His voice had that bright, brittle quality of someone trying to be adult on a wire that keeps dipping. They're selling me out if I don't wire. He'd learned the vocabulary, the vowels were new wider, panicked. I told him the only honest thing: size down to what you can carry without a margin clerk as roommate cash is the only silence you can buy right now. I did not say hold. I did not say fold. I said, know your floor before someone else marks it for you. He hung up with a thank you that sounded like an apology. Second, my mother. Sell now. No punctuation marks beyond the necessary. Each word its own metal bar. Behind her message I could feel a living room TV tuned to a crawl, a newscaster pronouncing consonants like verdicts. I thumbed back, working, and put the phone face down, because there are days when love and price discover how little they owe each other. We brought artifact #4 back up the cropped clearing note with NSCC VAR deposit, T+2, $$ billions, and held it beside fresh, internal timestamps that read like an EKG, time, increment, jagged, higher, jagged. There is an ugliness in seeing the scaffolding of a system laid bare while you are still standing on it. Policy sentences arrived in clean fonts: opening transactions restricted, closing transactions permitted, and hit the public like a slap. The chats flared with constitutional energy. If buying is speech, who pressed mute, they screenshotted the phrase into a poster. They made it a ringtone. Friends split not along intelligence lines but along appetite. One texted, principle, don't reward asymmetry with retreat. Another, prudence, don't let someone else price your last share. Both were right, which made neither useful. Keith stayed legible. He didn't sermonize. He itemized what he could show. He showed what he couldn't. He stamped with risk and moved on. Our ledger took the same medicine. I wrote, 12:03, feature flag flips, public discovers plumbing. I added the question that wouldn't sit still. Who benefits from an exit that's cheaper than an entry? In living rooms and basements the world over, people rehearse the new ritual. Tap buy, get a red bar, tap sell, get a fill, tap buy again, get policy. They recorded their screens like crime scenes. The motif in my head dropped a half step without the number returning, a kind of phantom ping you hear after firecrackers. The market still moved, prints, halts, breathbut, the psychology inverted. The staircase we climbed with gears had turned into a set of one-way doors. I stared at the legal pad 140, then at the cropped lines with their unpoetic acronyms, then at the chat window where someone had typed it again, the only sentence that matched the shape of the day. If buying is speech, who pressed mute?
Chapter 7. Climax.
The first halt felt like a cough in a crowded theater, small, involuntary, instantly contagious. When the tape resumed, prints leapt as if they'd been running in place behind the curtain, then sliced back so quickly the screen looked like it had dropped a frame. A second halt, stacked on the first like glass panes leaning against a wall. In the chat windows, the emojis dimmed and the timestamps took over 10, 10, 10, 10, 10. The cadence of people who had realized that their memory of this hour would have to stand up as evidence. Price didn't fall, it sheared, long green replaced by red that felt heavier than color. Bids that had been stairs became trapdoors. Offers that had been ceilings turned into skylights nobody wanted to climb toward. The options chain, which had been humming like a conveyor, seized, then lurched, then seized again delta, shedding like a winter tree when the wind flips. Dealers unwound hedges in ragged lots, as indifferent to our sentiment on the way down as they'd been on the way up. Neutrality is a cold god. Threads spawned documents became boilerplate. Boilerplate became intent. Collecting exhibits, a stranger posted, and beneath it a living spreadsheet filled itself. Name, broker, platform message, screenshot link, timestamp, a lawyer's account unverified, then verified by the way the comments flowed around. It dropped a Google form like a lifeboat off the stern. People filled it between halts as if completing a census at sea. We were watching a lawsuit draft itself in real time, not because anyone had rehearsed this play, but because the internet knows how to staple rage to process. On our desk, the talismans stayed in frame, the legal pad, 140 does a year, in thick Sharpie artifact hash, 4 cropped lines NSCC VAR deposit, T+2, dollar billions. The room's audio was different now, even the keyboard sounded out of breath. Keith didn't perform. He reconciled. Uncomfortable, he said again, which landed like a tourniquet. He pointed not to a savior, not to a villain, but to the loop we diagrammed 2 days ago. Options right arrow hedges, right arrow inventory tightens, right arrow DTC stretches. On the way up, structure carried price, he said. On the way down, structure wants it back. No music, just math read aloud. Halts multiplied. Someone mapped them as hash marks on a photo of the intraday chart. It looked like tallying days on a cell wall. The spreads in cash blew out, came in, blew out wider. Liquidity is courteous until it isn't. An ops friend typed, and I wrote it into the ledger because aphorisms this clean don't come twice in a day. Borrow fees printed like parking tickets that had learned to sprint. Days to cover, which had been a theoretical choke, turned visible exits crowding an aisle, elbows and ribs, the fire door closer than it looked and smaller than anyone remembered. Here is payoff hash 4. The number on the pad was never a dare. It was an MRI. 140. 0 didn't predict euphoria, it diagnosed load-bearing steel where drywall should have been. On the ascent, that ratio translated ordinary buying into mechanical scarcity. In the break, it translated mechanical scarcity into the kind of fragility that turns price into a staircase missing steps. The system did not implode because a meme got loud, it seized because obligations larger than the shelf finally met a tempo no balance sheet could serenely fund. Ping 1 octave lower. I wish there were a cleaner sentence to put in the record. There isn't. Some who had promised to be granite became riverstones, and rolled others who had never promised anything turned into anchors you could tie a boat to. The forum divided in the ways only conviction can, principle versus affidavit versus Hass. Phil, this is speech versus Hass. This is risk. The only people who looked consistent were the ones with ledgers open. Entries, exits, size, timestamps, receipts. Screenshots, the internet's native bond. Price found the kind of floor that doesn't look like a floor until later, more a pause in the violence than a vow of safety. Halts thinned, then stopped. The tape breathed like someone coming back from cold water. In the quiet between 2 candles, a call we were owed did not come back. Just a gap ring, voicemail, ring in absence shaped like a person. We logged the gap in the ledger because trust is a position too, and today it printed red. Keith ended the stream without a benediction. He reconciled columns, circled risk, refused adjectives, and left the grid on screen for a few extra seconds so anyone who needed a clock could have one. We muted the monitors and let the room be a room again. The pad, with 140, sat there like a witness who had told the truth from the start and was now excused. If you want the hour in one line, structure, not sentiment, detonated sentiment merely provided the fuse length. The market wrote that sentence across every screen in fonts nobody liked, but everybody had to read. We saved the chart, saved the cropped email, saved the chat transcript with the timestamps, and closed the folder named Ledger. Outside, Boston did what cities do, kept moving. Inside, we learned what markets do when a number is a mirror. The reckoning didn't arrive with speeches, it arrived as performance marks. Before the month even closed, a number leaked that sounded like a siren heard underwater, down 53% for January at one of the marquee shorts. Rooms that had practiced poise went quiet in the way only capital can enforce. The lifelines that had been wired in mid-month bought time, not absolution time, it turned out, was the one commodity the mechanism kept taxing. When your inventory is borrowed, patience accrues interest. When your thesis is crowded, pain compounds. Capitulations rarely look like a single white flag, they look like 100 small surrenders. A risk committee moves a line on a whiteboard from maintain to reduce. A PM who swore he would be disciplined becomes convincingly flexible. Slippage that was an error becomes a plan, just get me smaller. The borrow screen, which once felt like a spreadsheet, starts to feel like a mirror. And somewhere between a morning huddle and an afternoon halt, a sentence replaces conviction. We're out. That sentence doesn't ring, it ripples through baskets, through pairs, through names that rhyme with the one that just drew blood. The ledger records the shape of it, because headlines always sand down the edges. First came the quiet covers no one wanted to timestamp, the risk-off for optics trims posted to blotters like apologies. Then, the redemptions whispered behind glass investors who can absorb a thesis being wrong, but not a month shaped like a cliff. Fees backstopped bravado until they didn't. The forum had its own word for this churn capitulation, but what we saw on our screens was more anatomical. Obligations seeking the nearest exit and finding each other in the same hallway. We wrote a note beneath the day's print so we wouldn't forget how the sound changed. Trust call, not returned. It was literal one voice that should have come back to our desk and didn't, and it was metaphor. For days, the street had priced GME as if the choreography were known and the dancers would keep their footing. Then one player slipped, another grabbed a shoulder, a third let go on purpose, and the choreography turned into physics. The absence of that single call left a negative space our ears kept tracing. In a market built on confidence, silence is a price. Later, the stories would get tidy. New money in, losses contained, reputations repaired or retired. The archives version is uglier, and I think truer. The month ended with funds that had been nouns turned into past tense. The iconic short that printed the 53% would live on for a while, then not closed in a spring 2 calendars later, with letters that said they had learned. Learning is expensive when the syllabus includes 140.0. The forum didn't spike the football, it stapled screenshots. Our page for that day carries none of the memes, only 3 lines. Position smaller, patience thinner, trust unpaid. I taped that page beside the legal pad so the moral and the math would share a frame. Liquidity had reminded us of its oldest rule. It goes where it is loved, then leaves when it is needed. Confidence, it turns out, is collateral with no CUSIP and no grace period. You can pledge it every morning, you cannot settle at T+2.
Chapter 8. Aftermath.
Washington put the market on a grid. Little squares of faces, oath hands cropped at the wrist, a C-SPAN clock in the corner like a metronome that could be impeached but never paused. We watched from the same kitchen where the pads still read 140. 0, the grid taped beside it, our private ledger facing the public one. The committee titled it, Something tidy game stopped, as if the question mark could lower volatility. Names that had been tickers became witnesses. The broker that flipped the feature flag, the market maker that hedges the street's nerves, the fund that wore the losses, the platform where an army learned to speak in screenshots, and the man in the red headband who refused to speak in anything but receipts. Price had already done its theater. This was about plumbing and principal sharing the same microphone. The choreography ran exactly as you would sketch it if you'd read the emails we saved. T+2, VAR, concentration, extraordinary conditions. You could hear the institutional grammar trying to turn a sprint into a walk. The broker's testimony translated our artifact #4 into congressional tone. Deposits assessed by models, capital cushions sized for yesterday's weather, exposure profiles that sprint faster than wire rooms can breathe. The market maker spoke in the language of neutrality executions at scale, risk managed in microseconds, while the fund explained that conviction is a curve until it becomes a cliff. Reddit's CEO defended speech as if it were a badly misunderstood API. And then the camera found Keith. Headband folded neat, voice plain, the grid's columns invisible, but implied. He swore nothing more exotic than that he had liked the stock, past tense and present in the same breath, and the room's heat dropped a few degrees. The soundbite that would outlive the hearing arrived like a mid-roll silence. I am not a cat. It was a joke in form and a firewall in function. A line that severed persona from manipulation, theater from fraud, and turned an allegation into an anatomy lesson. The follow-up sentence did the heavier lift. In short, I like the stock. 10 words that reduced months of candles and hours of rage to the only disclosure that matters in a market built on choice. The meme economy heard a punchline, the regulatory year heard a boundary. Our ledger heard a payoff, artifact #5 stamped with a clock, the motif in our heads dropping one last half step as the number on the pad became a mirror held up to a system that preferred not to see itself. What looked like spectacle on television felt, to us, like a fight over definitions. Is buying speech or exposure? Is a forum a crowd or a control system? When a broker restricts the entry lane and leaves the exit open, is that triage or tilt? The committee tried to flatten it into villains and victims. The transcripts insisted on pipes and limits. We recognized the geometry from the ops floor. If T+2 is a conveyor and VAR is a ratchet, then policy will always arrive disguised as fairness, because spelling out balance sheet survival on air is bad television. The members aimed at pay-for-order flow, gamification, and the color of buttons. The mechanism that actually snapped didn't care about pallets. It cared about directionality, range, and the speed of money compared to the speed of models. There were confessions, though none used that word. Extraordinary market conditions. Exponential increase in collateral requirements. A decision made to protect the firm and our customers. We heard. The invoice outran the wire. There were denials that sounded like truisms. No coordination, best execution, neutral routing. We heard. Plumbing did what plumbing does when a city on a hill floods. And there was a moment easy to miss, unless you've stared at locate queues and haircut tables, when a member asked why selling stayed open. The broker answered with risk, net exposure, and market integrity, which is congressional for the ugly sentence we wrote into the ledger the day it happened. Closing buys slows the sprinting step of the deposit. Ask closing sells freezes the room with everyone in it. The math picked, the policy people picked the adjectives. Keith didn't offer absolution, only arithmetic. He explained position, process, and patience with the same pedagogy that had deputized a forum into a rehearsal for owning your own numbers. You could almost see the grid hovering ghost-like over his shoulder, the columns we'd reconciled 100 times. When a member asked if he'd manipulated markets, the headband might as well have been a notary ribbon again. I shared research. I took risk. I posted receipts. In that sequence lives a civics the market often forgets. Analysis is speech, execution is choice, the ledger is proof. The committee adjourned into press lines and clips. We closed our laptop and wrote the only summary that mattered to our file. Price gave way to principle. Principle collided with plumbing. spoke in invoices, invoices wrote the plot. When the camera lights cooled, the culture did what it always does: cut the day into artifacts. The Chiron timestamp, the oath still, the line about cats that became a t-shirt and, for a few of us, a standard of proof. The markets did what they always do: repriced memory. Spreads normalized, then widened unpredictably around earnings like old wounds in the cold. But something permanent had moved. Crowded shorts and beloved brands stopped being clever retail attention, stopped being noise you could hedge out 140. Zero stopped being graffiti in a margin and became a sign over a door labeled system limits. The hearing hadn't solved the geometry, it had simply printed it to record. We filed the clip under artifact #5, let the motif land its final, lowest ping, and turned the page. The next entries would be slower and stranger, reforms that crawled, copycats that sprinted, and a return that proved memory has momentum. The market didn't go back to sleep, it changed its posture. After the hearings cooled and the candles thinned, we watched a new species of tape emerge, one that priced attention as a factor and treated crowds as a balance sheet item. The day after GME stopped being a headline, other tickers learned to hum in the same key. The swarm didn't move on, it federated. Movie theaters with balance sheets, built like old stadiums. Electronics names that smelled like the first phone you took apart. Once forgotten brands that lived rent-free in people's childhoods all discovered what it meant to be not just securities, but symbols. If you squinted at the order book, you could see nostalgia itself trading, a bid for memories that might yet cash flow if the right operator found a lever. The candles were noisy, the cohort was not. It had learned cadence from a grid and a headband. Inside firms, alt data teams who used to sell slide decks about weather now sold dashboards that measured jokes. A new set of dials appeared on risk call screens, mentions per minute, unique commenter velocity, options chain crowding at retail-friendly strikes, borrow tightness overlaid with sentiment slope. There was a heat map for fragility, short interest times, days to cover times, social acceleration that told PMs which names could turn from thesis to physics by lunch. Analysts snickered in January. By spring, they scheduled their snickering. The street began to budget for weekends the way coastal towns budget for hurricane season. The sell short playbook, which used to read like a craft manual, got revised with a warning label. Public, crowded shorts and brands with emotional equity, fewer and smaller. Never be the headline became a policy, not a quip. Pairs traders shifted to stealthier hedges baskets, took a little more of the weight. Where a fund once wore a 10% position, like a merit badge, the same exposure became a dozen 1% lines dispersed across rhymes, the way you carry nitroglycerin in many vials. If you had to be short, you preferred boring businesses, with boring customers and boring forums, no mascots, no midnight releases, no decade-old gift cards in kitchen drawers. The question, what's the borrow? Learn to travel with a second question, what's the story? Not narrative in the pejorative sense, narrative as a risk factor you could wake up to on a Sunday. Brokers rewrote playbooks too. Risk banners that once showed up like disclaimers on an airplane safety card started to talk like weather alerts, elevated borrow, opening only, HTB surcharge, and they arrived earlier, sometimes prophylactically, because a model had learned to fear not just range, but rehearsed range. Ops leads kept the VAR slide in their hip pockets for town halls, and a few finally got budget to talk settlement plumbing out loud. I watched one mid-tier shop add an internal drill simulated T+2 spikes seeded with social data so that the console flip, if it ever came again, would sound less like a siren and more like a seatbelt chime. On the other side of the glass, companies relearned investor relations as a live medium. The clever ones stopped litigating memes and started instrumenting them. Faster, 8Ks when borrow tightened preemptive queue, and as that translated transformations into posture and plan, operators who understood that radical legibility store metrics, channel mix, SKU velocity, could serve as a countermove to crowded short thesis before the first borrow fee ticked. A few even built their own grids, not as theater, but as clocks the street could set expectations against. The point wasn't to meme yourself higher, It was to deny the oxygen of uncertainty to anyone building a case on inevitability. Retail didn't dissolve back into dumb money. It organized around two durable instincts: legibility and leverage. The grid taught a generation that receipts beat adjectives. The chain taught them how time turns into torque. Many learned the hard part: slippage, assignment, tax lots, and kept the muscle anyway. We like the stock matured into we know the mechanics. The average account didn't become a quant, it became something more destabilizing, a participant with a shared clock and a taste for receipts. Even where the cohort lost, it learned how to lose out loud, which is its own kind of governance. Screenshots stayed the internet's native bond. In that environment, the quietest change was also the deepest. Pros began to price attention, risk the way they price liquidity, and crowding. You could hear it in risk meetings. What's the squeezability? What's the meme half-life? Who's the face? And you could see it in sizing sheets that once ignored those nouns. The dials did not eliminate shorts, they de-romanticized them. The best now asked for asymmetry without spectacle, borrow without folklore, and they paid for that humility with basis points they considered insurance. We taped a new page into the ledger with one sentence across the top: the cohort is permanent, not an insurgency, a constituency. Markets had to learn a new civics where choice travels at meme speed and arithmetic still settles T+2. That is the paradigm. Attention trades, legibility governs, and any thesis that depends on strangers panicking on schedule now has to out-argue a camera that remembers. The ledger flips to the section everyone swears they love: policy. After the hearings and the headlines, the question that followed us home was simple and joyless: what actually changed? We set the pad with 140.0 beside a fresh page labeled in my neatest hand: FOF, gamification, short transparency, settlement. The page filled the way regulation does incrementally, with verbs that prefer the passive voice. Payment for order flow was first into the dock. The postmortems ran the old arguments on fresh batteries. Is routing retail to wholesalers a subsidy for commission-free trading or a toll booth that hides price improvement in the spread? The answer, predictably, was it depends, and the remedy, predictably, was disclosure more of it, in more places, with finer print about execution quality and conflicts. Some rules hardened best execution as an obligation you could audit, and there were auction experiments put on the whiteboard to test whether competition could pry a few more cents from the inside market. Meanwhile, the app in your pocket still sold your orders where the pipes run fastest. Money talked. Policy workshopped. Gamification showed up in scare quotes because regulators dislike metaphors but love warnings. Digital engagement practices got memos and footnotes. The confetti vanished. The push alerts learned to say risk out loud. Streaks and scratch-offs lost their shine in design reviews. Guidance arrived with the tone of a school principal you remember as fair, persuasive, firm, unenforceable, at industrial scale unless someone crossed a line flamboyantly. A few cases made the news. Most of the behavior simply tucked in its shirt. Short-selling transparency promised more sunlight and delivered it by skylight, not window. Aggregated reports, delayed and sanitized, inched from theory toward practice. You could see the tide level, not the swimmers. Fails to deliver tables got new readers beneficial ownership proposals, learned the difference between a hedge and a huddle. The forums wanted an X-ray. The rulebook offered an ultrasound. Useful, incomplete, and late. Settlement was the one place the pipes actually moved. T+2 shortened to T+1 one day, sawn off the conveyor that had turned VAR asks into a sprint. That mattered. It lowered the amount of time exposure could accumulate and the volume of tomorrow money that forced those billion-dollar deposit emails. But it did not change how intraday volatility multiplies obligations or how concentration makes a model's hand shake. We joked, in the way people do when they're serious, that regulators had narrowed the hallway while keeping the same number of exits. Safer, yes. Fireproof, no. Why so modest relative to the cultural crater January left. Because law travels by committee and culture by meme. Statutes require consensus. A swarm only needs a clock. The crowd rewired its habits in a weekend learning execution quality, reading chain structure, stapling receipts to belief. The rulebook added line items and audits. It was not nothing. It was also not the thing the internet had learned to want. On my pad, I drew 2 columns: law and memory. Under law, disclosures, audits, a shorter settle. Under memory, screenshots, timestamps. A shared sense that we liked the stock became a civic sentence whether or not the footnotes approved. The gap between them is where future episodes will live. Policy can narrow that gap with better plumbing. It cannot outlaw reflexivity or legislate conviction. The market we inherit from 140.0 is one where pipes are tighter and crowds are louder, where fair means both price improvement on a trade blotter and dignity for 1,000 small accounts that won't be treated as noise. The motif in my head dropped one last half step nearly at rest, not because we fixed the system, but because we finally wrote in ink what it is. In May, the room we'd sealed in 2021 breathed again, first as a wink, a cryptic post, a familiar silhouette animated by nothing more than timing. No thesis thread, no 10-minute explainer, just enough voltage to make old screenshots reappear in new feeds. Memory is a balance sheet, attention is its liquidity. The flows were instantaneous, not because the math had changed, but because the archive had never really closed. You could feel the muscle memory of the crowd, we like the stock reduced to a tap, a share, a DM. Then June delivered the document everyone waited for, a single image that didn't brag so much as reconcile positions enumerated, exposure squared, a grid that read like the return of a ledger rather than the start of a rally. Receipts again, not slogans. The frame snapped back into place. Ratio on the left, receipts on the right, ping flat, like a tuning fork struck once and left to hum. What did it prove? That reflexivity wasn't a parlor trick, it was infrastructure. Posts moved price, not because words are spells, but because conviction documented in public alters counterparties' incentives in private. Market makers hedge the flows they can see, shorts fund the risk they can no longer ignore, brokers model collateral against realized variance, not yesterday's etiquette. In 2021, we called that sequence gears. In 2024, the same teeth meshed faster because the drawings were already on the wall. The archive taught the audience to read the plumbing, and once you can read it, you can time it. The point wasn't nostalgia. It was legibility at scale. The counter-narrative formed on cue, think pieces about bubbles with better lighting, reminders that settlement still outruns sentiment, that clearing still bills before lunch. All true. But the cultural delta was elsewhere. Retail didn't need a mascot to chant, it needed a ledger to synchronize. That's why the screenshot mattered more than any headline. It converted remember went into reconcile now. It wasn't the size, it was the specificity. Strikes, dates, lots enough to let strangers stress test the posture in public. Legibility beat volume again. That was always the trick. By the second week, you could hear the old motif under ordinary noise: coffee grinders, Slack pings, the radiators hiss, a half-remembered metronome from a kitchen table where 140.0 first taught us the difference between a number and a limit. That limit still lives in the plumbing, the lesson still lives in the people. Artifact #5 had already shown how a meme becomes testimony. The 2024 posts showed how testimony becomes habit. The market hadn't forgiven or forgotten, it had updated. If 2021 was a discovery structure disguised as sentiment, then 2024 was a rehearsal. Proof that memory shortens the distance between a seed and its payoff, between a ping and a price.
Epilogue.
I keep the pad. Same kitchen, same table. The ink has faded a tone, but 140.0 still sits there like a witness that declines to embellish. We once treated it as math. It was, and it wasn't. The number measured inventory, an obligation. What it failed to measure was appetite, how many strangers would decide, in public, to carry risk together and insist on receipts. The ledger taught us that facts travel farther when they're legible. The headband taught us that legibility is a promise, not a pose. A crowd synchronized to a cadence because someone accounted in daylight. That's the piece every model mispriced. You can regression a chart, you can't regression a vow. When the system snapped, it didn't confess it invoiced. We learned an ugly elegance. Confidence is collateral with no CUSIP, and when it's gone, you can't settle it T+2. I still hear the shape of that lesson in the quiet after a close, the way a room sounds when trust has been margin called and nobody can wire it back before lunch. We wrote it down so memory wouldn't sand the edges off. Price is fast, principle is slower, plumbing is slower still, and yet plumbing writes the plot. Later, under hearing lights, the line that should have been a punchline, I am not a cat, read like a standard of proof. Analysis is speech. Execution is choice. The ledger is evidence. That afternoon, performative certainty bowed to documented conviction, and a meme became testimony. We filed it as artifact #5 not because it was cute, but because it made the civics plain. And then 2024 proved the muscle had memory. A cryptic wink, a grid returned, and suddenly the archive behaved like infrastructure. Reflexivity wasn't sorcery, it was habit posts that rerouted hedges, receipts that shortened the distance from seed to payoff. You could feel the market update its priors. Attention isn't noise, it's a flow you ignore at cost. So here's the line I keep for myself, and for you, if you want it. 140.0 was never about a clever integer beating a bad thesis. It was about people refusing to be priced as noise. In markets built on confidence, the smallest unit of liquidity is conviction. I can show you the math. I can't supply the courage. That part you post, time-stamped, under your own name. Then you live with the tape. Then you live with yourself.
We return the exhibits to their sleeves, the phone snap of a yellow pad, the crooked thumbnail with a red band, a grid of unglamorous cells, a clipped clearing notice with acronyms that outlive apologies, a hearing clock that stamped a joke into jurisprudence. The witness has stepped back into the crowd. What remains is the ledger. Dated, witnessed, reconciled. On the first page, the number reads the same as it did at 8:31. 140.0. Ink doesn't rally. It does not plead. It waits. Pages later, you can hear what the number foretold. Mechanics becoming memory. Memory becoming motive. Somewhere between a console pre-order and a committee gavel, a market discovered that structure has feelings only when people give it theirs. We file the annotations. Seeds at 20, 40, 60, 90, 120. Paid in full. We mark the silences where the tape spoke clearer than any caption. We underline the sentence the friend left behind. The smallest unit of liquidity is conviction. It will be misquoted. Most true things are. Now the sonic tag that guided you. For every return of the ratio, a note falling half a step descends one last time. Ping. One octave lower, then none at all. Not because the story is over, but because its signal has merged with the noise it changed. What does a market remember? Prices for a while. What do people remember? Choices, much longer. We close the folder. We shelve the archive. The number remains. The lesson remains louder. The ledger closes, the number remains. If markets remember prices, people remember choices. File ends.